We are continuing for the second week our series, Keeping Christ in Christmas. If you weren't here last Sunday and you're wondering why we're talking about Christmas in November, it's because this series is very application heavy, and if we wait until December to talk about these issues, about ways to keep Christ in Christmas, then it will be too late to act on them. So we're preparing now by talking about biblical, practical ways to bring Christ to a highly secular world. And just how secular, I was made aware of that this week. I was listening to one of the Christian radio stations, and they shared a recent study. Less than 20% of people in the U.S. attend church on a regular basis. Less than 20%. And when you consider that of that 20%, many of them are not Christians, they are simply churchgoers, that's scary. And that's a solid reason for us to be bringing Christ into our culture. So last Sunday we talked about, in terms of keeping Christ in Christmas, that it's not about arguing over words and letters like Xmas or Happy Holidays. Today we're looking at Christ in the poor as a way of keeping Christ in Christmas. The very first Christmas is painted in the color of poverty. Mary and Joseph were in Bethlehem because their Roman overlords wanted more money from their subjects, people who were already overtaxed, overburdened, and quite often poverty-stricken. They got to Bethlehem and there were no hotel rooms, so they stayed in a cave. I know the paintings and the nativity scenes that you put out at Christmas have a nice wooden building, but it wasn't that. They were in a cave. The floor was carpeted with hay and dirt and bugs and filth. The God of Heaven's very first bed was an animal's feeding trough. The first visitors were shepherds who were very low on the Judean social ladder. And when it came time for Mary and Joseph to take Jesus to the temple and dedicate him, they couldn't afford a lamb. So they took a poor person's offering, either 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons. So since we're getting ready to celebrate the birthday of somebody born into intense third world poverty, it's right for us to ask questions like, what responsibility, if any, do I have to those who are truly poor? What is my attitude about those living in poverty? Does my attitude reflect God's attitude? Or does it reflect some other ideology? And then perhaps the question, what do the poor have to do with me keeping Christ in Christmas? Well, way back in the book of Deuteronomy, long before Jesus was even born, God, speaking through Moses, formulated a very logical answer to those questions. So we're going to be in Deuteronomy 15. We're going to start with just chapter 4. And we'll talk about this in a little bit, but the first few verses, God is explaining what we're calling the year of forgiveness, when debts were to be canceled. And we're going to pick this up in verse 4. However, there need be no poor people among you, for the land the Lord your God is giving you to possess as your inheritance, he will richly bless you. God takes care of us. God had promised the people of Israel a land of special blessing, a land, the popular phrase, flowing with milk and honey. He was going to provide for them. Now, there's a lot of rules we have to keep in mind when we're interpreting Old Testament texts, especially texts about Israel that make specific promises for Israel. We have to be very careful how we apply those to ourselves. And 2 of those rules that are really important for today are, first, America is not the new Israel. So we cannot directly apply the promises of the land and the promises made directly to Israel. We cannot apply those on a 1-to-1 ratio to us as a nation. But the second rule is there will be truths and there will be applications that we can draw from these texts about the nation of Israel and God's promises to them and apply those to ourselves. Now, you don't have to turn with me, you can just listen, but Back in Deuteronomy 8, verses 7 through 9, we get a really good description of this land that God's leading them to. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land with brooks, streams, and deep springs gushing out into the valleys and hills, a land with wheat and barley, vines and fig trees, pomegranates, olive oil, and honey, a land where bread will not be scarce and you will lack nothing, a land where the rocks are iron and you can dig copper out of the hills. Imagine how good that sounded to people who had been wandering in the desert and eating nothing but manna and quail. Some of the people who heard this, the only life they knew was the desert. But using those rules we talked about for interpreting these texts about Israel, there is a principle, a truth that we can draw out of this text where Moses describes this beautiful land that God's taking the people of Israel to, a land where they'll lack nothing. And the principle we can draw from that is we are the land of plenty. The United States of America is the land of plenty. There is absolutely no reason anyone in the United States, or I'll even say beyond, should go without the basic necessities of life. We are the land of plenty. There is no reason that anybody in our country or beyond should go without clean water, electricity, warmth in the winter, clothes, food, access to medical treatment, access to education. There's absolutely no reason that this should happen. Every good thing you have is a gift from God. Your family, your marriage, your job, your paycheck, your house, your clothes, they belong to God. They don't belong to you. We're stewards. A steward is somebody who takes care of the resources of another person and who takes care of those resources in the way that that other person wants them to. And God gives us stuff, whether it's a car or money or whatever, to help other people. God gives things to us and says, here, take these things and use them to help people who do not have these things. So God takes care of us. And in response to that, God expects our obedience. We're back in Deuteronomy 15, verses 5 and 6. And I'm going to read verse 4 again because they tie in. However, there need be no poor among you, for in the land the Lord your God is giving you to possess as your inheritance, he will richly bless you. That's verse 4. Verse 5. If, and I'm going to stop right there. When you're studying the Bible, the smaller a word is, the more important it probably is, because those little itty-bitty words imply some kind of connection to what preceded them. And here, that little itty-bitty word in English is 2 letters, if. The Lord is going to bless you if only you fully obey the Lord your God and are careful to follow all these commands I am giving you today. For the Lord your God will bless you as he has promised, and you will lend to many nations, but will borrow from none. You will rule over many nations, but none will rule over you. The blessings of the land hinged on Israel's obedience to God. This was a covenant, and in a covenant back in these days, there was a powerful party and there was a weaker party. And the powerful party made promises, usually to provide and protect for the weaker party. And the weaker party made promises. If it were between 2 kings, the weaker king would usually promise to bring a certain amount of gold and silver and whatever, animals, to the more powerful king once a year. And if the weaker party broke the covenant, then the more powerful party was no longer bound to keep their part, the promise of protection and the promise of provision. We live in a covenant with God through Jesus Christ, and our obedience is a response to God's goodness and God's mercy and God's grace. We do not earn God's goodness and mercy and grace by being obedient. We are obedient because God is good and merciful and gracious. Whenever we relate to God, no matter what we may think, God always moves first. God always speaks first. God always acts first. So our obedience is in response to the goodness and the grace and the love and the mercy of God. Now, so this is not, quid pro quo. This is not, God, I'll scratch your back if you'll scratch mine. We are not obedient to God because of specific blessings, as if God were Santa Claus. God gave me a nice job, so I'm going to be obedient to him. God gave me the most awesome wife in the world, so I'm going to be obedient to him. No, that's not how it works. We are obedient simply because God is God. Faith is obedience, and obedience is faith, period. If you have faith, if you believe who God is, and believe in what God says, and believe in Jesus Christ and that God raised him from the dead, but that faith does not lead to obedience, that's a dead faith. And it does nobody any good. We are obedient simply because of God's love for us. And we're not being obedient to a tyrant. You just got to turn on the news and you can see the countries where people have to be obedient to a tyrant. And you see what happens to them if they are not obedient. We are expected to be obedient to a loving Father who cares for us and knows what is best for us and does what is best for us. And as I told the folks at the first service, when we are obedient to God, it is almost a selfish act, because when we're obedient to God, we are doing what is best for ourselves. Even if what I want to do, what I think will lead to my betterment, is different than what obedience to God leads me to do, when I do what God tells me to do, I'm doing what's best for me. Now, that shouldn't be our primary motivation, but hopefully it'll be a little kick in the pants for all of us when we consider our obedience to God. We are being obedient to a God who loves us. So God takes care of us. And in response, God expects our obedience. And the obedience that God is expecting in this instance is that we take care of the poor and that we do it with the right attitude. Deuteronomy 15, 7 through 11. If anyone is poor among your fellow Israelites in any of the towns of the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward them. Rather, be open-handed and freely lend them whatever they need. Be careful not to harbor this wicked thought: the seventh year, the year for canceling debts, is near. In other words, don't think, okay, the seventh year is 6 months away, so if I lend this money, I'm never going to get it back because the debt will be canceled, and so this isn't a good choice for me. He's saying, don't think that way. So that you do not show ill will toward the needy among your fellow Israelites and give them nothing. They may then appeal to the Lord against you, and you will be found guilty of sin. Give generously to them, and do so without a grudging heart. Then because of this, the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and in everything you put your hand to. There will always be poor people in the land. Therefore, I command you to be open-handed toward your fellow Israelites who are poor and needy in your land. Now, this is one of those cases where, drawing on that first rule I mentioned earlier, we cannot make a direct one-to-one nationalistic application of this. Because if you notice the wording, it said, be generous to the Israelites in your land. And if you read the first 3 verses of Deuteronomy 15, when God talks about the year of canceling debts, he says, for whatever reason, you may expect payment from a foreigner, but not from a fellow Israelite. And so a lot of people have taken this and applying it one-on-one, say, okay, I got to be generous to poor Americans, but not others. Well, it doesn't work that way. America is not the special called people of God as Israel was. The church is now God's special people. So people who have made that step sometimes say, okay, well, that means I only have to be generous to poor Christians. I don't have to be generous to poor people if they're not part of the church, if they're not part of God's universal church. But that's an improper deduction and application also. The God that we see in Jesus Christ would not make that delineation. He says, here are the poor, help them. And do it, we read, with the right attitude. What's the right attitude? First, don't ignore the problem. God, through Moses, says there will always be poor people in the land. It's not going to go away. Don't ignore it. I know how easy it is to drive past somebody with a sign saying, I'm starving, I need food. And I can't tell you how many times my wife has gone on to McDonald's or something and bought a bunch of food and taken it back to these people and talked with them. Even when she's by herself and alone, she's trusting in God to provide and to keep her safe. And I know we can't do that in every instance, but if we can drive past every person we see in need, there's something wrong in the heart. So don't ignore the problem. Don't be stingy. Remember what I said about us being stewards? Everything we have is God's. He's given it to us to help other people. Don't be selfish. When we're selfish, we're looking inward and we only focus on us, and we don't see what's going on with other people, especially the people who fall outside of our sphere. And so if I'm selfish, I'm not going to see the people that need my help. Don't look for reasons not to help. We do this so well. It's called rationalization. We can always come up with a reason not to help. And I'm not saying don't be naive, or I'm not saying be naive. If your radar goes off, if you know something, behind the scenes, you got to consider that. But we can fall into the habit of looking for an excuse in every situation. Not this time, not this time, not this time, not this time. Don't do that. Don't be judgmental. We assume we know why people are poor. Well, we don't know what's going on. We don't know what's going on behind the scenes if somebody's living in true poverty. And when we make a judgment, I tend to draw the wrong conclusions. Because my judgments are usually not based on the Spirit or Word of God. It's based on my upbringing and my politics, and I usually make the wrong conclusion. So those are all the don'ts. The do is, do be generous. We keep Christ in Christmas by joyfully and generously taking care of the poor in whatever way God opens up to us. We worship the King of the universe, who was born into a poverty that none of us can even begin to comprehend unless you've traveled to a third world country. And so we keep Christ in Christmas by joyfully and generously helping the poor. But before we can talk about practical ways of doing that, we have to deal with an attitude issue. Too many people assume that poverty is always or almost always the result of laziness, drugs, race, bad choices, or a sense of entitlement. And here again, I'm not naive. I'm not a Pollyanna. I know that there are instances when that is the case. But it is not nearly as often as we think it is. It is not nearly as often as many have led us to believe that it is. Those of us who are on the more conservative side of the spectrum, and I count myself on that, we need to admit that there are systemic issues that keep people trapped in poverty. And when I make a judgment, it's usually about the person, not the system, and so I draw the wrong conclusion. And even though, yes, sometimes there are people who are playing us, the thinking of the church throughout most of church history has been, the reason doesn't matter. If the poor person is in front of you, help them. Martin Luther says, he who has nothing to live on should be helped. If he deceives us, what then? Help him again. And you've got to work out for yourself, between you and God, what that looks like in your life. I can't tell you what that looks like. You've got to work that out. But we have to admit that there are Systemic issues that keep people trapped in poverty. When we see someone poor, we tend to think this is an issue of character. This is all about you. And sometimes it is. But more often than not, it's about the world into which they are born. And God recognized the systemic issues long before we did, of course. And he created what I referred to earlier, the year of forgiveness. Every 7 years, all debts were to be forgiven. Now just think about that. It's what, November 11th? Okay, January 1st, you get up to the ringing of the phone, and it's the bank that holds your mortgage. And they say, hey, it's the 7th year, so we just want to let you know, you don't owe us any more money. Yeah, I don't know who said that, but that's great. Imagine waking up to the ringing of the phone and it's a credit card holder. It's January 1st of the 7th year, so your debt is canceled. God actually put this into play because he knew there was going to be systemic structures that would keep people in poverty. So a poor person that has to borrow ends up poorer. And so God put this year of forgiveness, of the cancellation of debts into play so that the poor would not be stuck in a cycle, so that at the end of the 6 years when the debt was canceled, they would have a chance to start over again and get on their feet. Because God realized both there are these systemic issues and that poverty itself is cyclical. If you are born into true poverty, the chances are you will live in poverty, you will pass it on as though it were genetic, and you will die in poverty. Now, I know there are stories right here in this congregation of people who were born into true poverty and have, on your own or with the help of others, become financially stable and perhaps even wealthy. I know that. But those stories are not the norm. Go hang out in downtown Wilkes-Barre sometime. Come and visit me and let me take you for a walk around and you'll see it. Gary Haugen is a Christian. He works with the poor. And he describes how a history professor of his described this cyclical nature and how he described poverty. The history professor, now he's speaking of real third world poverty, but it applies to the truly poor here. He says, the poor are those who cannot afford to have bad luck. The poor are those who cannot afford to have bad luck. You can't get an infection because they don't have access to medical care. They can't get injured or miss the bus because if they don't make it to work, they will lose their menial job. They can't lose the change in their pocket because it may literally be all that they have. They can't afford for their goat to get sick because it's the only source of milk that they have. But then the professor said, the thing is, everybody experiences bad luck. Everybody's life tanks at some point. But most of us, if not all of us here, we have some buffers. We have some barriers that allow us to bounce back and recover when that happens to us. We have financial reserves. We have insurance. We have family with money. Whatever. We have a great church. But those who are truly poor don't have that. And so when the bad luck happens, it's just one setback after another. I may not be able to convince you of that this morning. Our views of poverty are shaped not only by the Bible, but by our politics, by our upbringing, by our own socioeconomic level. And perhaps this morning I may not be able to convince you of the truth that poverty is cyclical. But I can do this. As your pastor, on this Sunday, in this church, in this season coming upon us, I can encourage you to joyfully and generously care for the poor just because God says to. Now, I'm not saying that to make you feel guilty. And the fact is, the entire Christian life should always be just because God says so. But it's not. Our attitudes, our feelings, our upbringing, again, politics, whatever, these affect the way we choose to interpret God's word. But for just this upcoming season, I can encourage you, despite what you might really think about the poor and about poverty, I can encourage you to do something to keep Christ in Christmas by caring for the poor this year, just because God says to. It's easier to change a behavior than it is an attitude. And I believe that once we change a behavior, that God will work on our heart and change the attitude. And that our attitude will become more like Christ's. And that obedience will become second nature. So I promised up front this series was going to be very application heavy. So here's some ideas to keep Christ in Christmas this year by joyfully and generously caring for the poor. The first is adjust your attitude about your job. Bet you weren't expecting to hear that. Adjust your attitude about your job. Basil the Great, 4th century church leader. I love Basil. I love the name Basil, but I like what he says. He says, "He who labors ought to perform his task, not for the purpose of ministering to his own needs, but that he may accomplish the Lord's command, 'I was hungry and you gave me something to eat,' and so on." He literally says, "and so on." Everyone, therefore, in doing his work, should place before himself the aim of service to the needy and not his own satisfaction. Your job is one of those things you're a steward of. Your job isn't just there to provide for you and your family. As a Christian, your job is a blessing God has given you that you can use to provide for others, that you can use to take care of others who cannot take care of themselves. And as you're adjusting your attitude about your job, adjust your attitude about your possessions. Let me quote my buddy Basil again. "The bread you do not use is the bread of the hungry. The garment hanging in your wardrobe is the garment of the person who is naked. The shoes you do not wear are the shoes of the one who is barefoot. The money you keep locked away is the money of the poor." Here again, we're stewards. The stuff we have that we don't use, somebody else could be using it. Somebody could be wearing those shoes, wearing those clothes, eating the food that we look at the expiration date and it's close and we toss it in the garbage can. What you have is a gift from God to be used to help other people. The third suggestion, don't go into debt to pay for Christmas. Okay? Help me out again. Dave Ramsey. If you're a Christian and you're in debt, take the Dave Ramsey course. Do the stuff he tells you to do. But do not go into debt to pay for Christmas. Because your money is not your money. It is God's money. And when you are in debt, that is God's money locked up in somebody else's bank that you could be using to help somebody truly in need. Plus, as happy of a Christmas day it may give you, when those first bills start coming in at the end of January, you're going to be miserable anyway. You can practice what's called a 50-50 Christmas. Take your budget. Here's what we're going to spend on Christmas. Here's 100%. Take 50% and say we're going to use this to help the poor. Whether it's a local food bank, a local charity, there's still time to give to Operation Christmas Child. You can give online to them all year round. World Vision, you can buy a goat, a cow, a team of oxen, a flock of chicken, whatever, for an individual or a village in an underdeveloped part of the world. You can pay to have a well dug in an underdeveloped part of the world. There are hundreds of ways, use your own creativity, that you can take some of that money and use it for ministry. Do a 100% Christmas. My mom's been pushing this for years. Say, here's our budget. We're going to take all of it and use it somehow to help the poor. And for some of you, you literally could buy what you spend on Christmas, a team of oxen, or build half a dozen houses in a village somewhere in the world where people just don't have what we do. The church could do a Christmas card tree. Have you ever seen those? I've done them at other churches before. You get somebody with a little artistic ability to make a Christmas tree out of poster board. And then each of us, instead of sending 130 cards to everyone in the church, you put one on the tree. And then you calculate what you would have spent in cards and postage, and you take that money and you put it to use, helping the poor in some way. Use your own creativity. If your office or school does a gift exchange, use it as a way to help a local charity. Instead of bringing in goofy gifts that people are just going to throw away when the party's over, bring in things at food banks or clothing centers or homeless shelters can use. And just get as hands-on as you can. See a need, meet a need. And again, that's something you've got to work that out between you and God, what that looks like in your life. Whatever you do, do it quietly and do it privately. And whatever you do, keep in mind the words of Jesus, words that he says the faithful are going to hear from him someday. I was hungry. Jesus says, I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. And then these just tremendously awesome words. Truly, I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did it for me. That's one of the most awesome verses in the entire Bible. When you help somebody in need, you are literally directly helping Jesus face to face. Jesus is not being metaphorical here. He is not being figurative. We can tell by the context, he's not talking about those who are spiritually poor or spiritually hungry or spiritually thirsty or spiritually trapped in prison. He's talking about real people in real circumstances. And he makes it so easy for us because he says, all you got to do is help one of them and you're helping me. This November and this December, we are going to fret anxiously and nervously over a gift that is going to be unwrapped and forgotten by mid-January. I love my wife, and I can't tell you a thing she gave me for Christmas last year. Now, I can remember, some of the biggies from the last 5 to 10 years. But most presents we get, they're forgotten by mid-January. And while we're fretting over a toy, whether it's a kid's toy or an adult toy that's going to be forgotten in 2 weeks, there are people in our country and in the world going without the basic necessities of life. Keep Christ in Christmas this year by joyfully and generously investing your resources, and in particular yourself, into those who are living without. Amen.